Have you ever noticed something weird about really wealthy people? They're constantly talking about debt, taking on debt, using debt strategically, leveraging debt. Meanwhile, you've been told your entire life that debt is the enemy. Dave Ramsey says, cut up your credit cards. Your parents warned you about the dangers of borrowing. Financial gurus preach about being debt-free. But here's what nobody tells you. The rich don't avoid debt. They weaponize it. And the difference between how you use debt and how they use debt is the difference between staying broke and building serious wealth. Here at Simple Money, we've analyzed how wealthy people actually think about money. Not the sanitized advice they give in interviews, the actual strategies they use behind closed doors. Today, I'm going to show you why debt is the most misunderstood tool in personal finance, and how the same thing that destroys middle-class families makes rich people richer. Let me paint you a picture of how most people think about debt. Debt is bad. Debt is stress. Debt is something you fell into because you made poor decisions. And the goal is to get out of debt as fast as humanly possible. So you work extra hours, you skip vacations, you pour every spare dollar into paying off your car loan, your student loans, your credit cards, and when you're finally debt-free, you celebrate, you made it. You're responsible. But here's what's really happening. While you're aggressively paying down debt, you're missing opportunities. Think about it like this. Let's say you have an extra $500 this month. You could put it toward your car loan, or you could invest it in something that grows. Most people choose the car loan because debt feels like an emergency. It feels like a weight you need to remove immediately. But what if your car loan is at 4% interest and you could invest that money and earn 8%? You just chose to save $4 instead of making $8. That's a $4 loss. Multiplied by every month you make that same choice. Now, I'm not saying all debt is good. That's not the point here. The point is that wealthy people see debt differently. They see it as a tool, a lever, a way to multiply their results. Poor people borrow money to buy things that lose value. A new car, a bigger TV, a vacation they can't afford. Middle-class people borrow money and then panic about it. They lie awake at night worried about their mortgage. They feel guilty about their student loans. But wealthy people, they borrow money to buy things that make them more money, and they sleep just fine. The difference isn't moral. It's not about discipline or responsibility. It's about understanding what debt actually is and how it actually works. The first thing wealthy people understand is what I call good debt versus bad debt. Now, you've probably heard this before, but most explanations get it wrong. They'll tell you good debt is a mortgage and bad debt is credit cards. But that's way too simple. Here's the real distinction. Good debt makes you money. Bad debt costs you money. That's it. That's the only rule that matters. Let me explain. Say you borrow $200,000 to buy a rental property. You rent it out for $2,000 a month. Your mortgage payment is $1,500. You're cash flowing $500 every month. That debt is making you money. It's generating positive returns. That's good debt. Now, say you borrow $200,000 to buy a boat. That boat doesn't generate income. It costs you money to store it, maintain it, insure it, and it's losing value every single year. That debt is costing you money. That's bad debt. Here's where most people get confused. They think a mortgage is automatically good debt. But what if you buy a house you can't really afford? Your payment is $3,000 a month and you're stressed every single month trying to cover it. That's bad debt, even though it's a mortgage. Or here's another example. Say you put $5,000 on a credit card to take an online course that teaches you a high-income skill. You finish the course, you get a client, you make $15,000. That credit card debt just made you $10,000. That's good debt, even though it's a credit card. The psychology here is crucial. Most people have been conditioned to think about debt in categories. Mortgages are okay, credit cards are bad, student loans are acceptable, personal loans are sketchy. But wealthy people don't think in categories, they think in returns. Every time they borrow money, they ask one question: will this make me more money than it costs me? If yes, they borrow. If no, they don't. It's that simple. And this is why wealthy people often have millions of dollars in debt, not because they're reckless, but because they've borrowed millions to buy assets worth tens of millions that generate income. The debt is a tool, and tools aren't good or bad, they're just tools. What matters is what you build with them. The second thing wealthy people understand is leverage. And this might blow your mind a little, because leverage is how you turn small amounts of money into large amounts of wealth. Here's how it works. Let's say you have $50,000 in cash. You could buy a $50,000 investment outright. If that investment goes up 10%, you make $5,000. Not bad, that's a 10% return on your money. But here's what a wealthy person does. They take that $50,000 and use it as a down payment on a $250,000 property. They borrow the other $200,000 from the bank. Now, if that property goes up 10% in value, it's not worth $55,000. It's worth $275,000. You just made $25,000 on a $50,000 investment. That's a 50% return. That's leverage. You used borrowed money to control a much larger asset. And when that asset appreciates, you capture all the gains. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's say that property also generates rental income. $2,000 a month. Your mortgage is $1,500. You're pocketing $500. That's $6,000 a year in cash flow. On a $50,000 down payment, that's a 12% cash on cash return. Plus the appreciation, plus the tax benefits, plus the fact that your tenants are paying down your mortgage for you. Suddenly, that $50,000 is working way harder than it ever could sitting in a stock account. Now, you might be thinking, but what if the property value goes down? And that's a fair question. Leverage works both ways. If the property drops 10%, you've lost $25,000, which is 50% of your original investment. That's the risk. And this is why wealthy people are very careful about what they leverage into. They don't borrow money to buy things that depreciate. They don't use leverage on speculative bets. They use leverage on cash flowing assets with proven track records. The psychology most people miss is this. They think leverage is risky, and it can be, but not using leverage is also risky. If you save $50,000 and just leave it in a savings account earning 1%, you're losing money to inflation. That's a guaranteed loss. If you invest it without leverage and it returns 7%, you're making $3,500 a year after inflation. That's something. But if you use leverage intelligently, you could be making $15,000 to $20,000 a year on that same $50,000. The risk isn't in using leverage. The risk is in using leverage stupidly. Wealthy people understand the difference. The third thing wealthy people understand is the concept of interest rate arbitrage. Now, that sounds complicated, but it's actually super simple. You borrow money at a low rate and invest it at a higher rate. You pocket the difference. Let me give you a concrete example. Say you can get a mortgage at 4% interest. That's your cost of borrowing. You take that borrowed money and invest it in something that returns 8%, maybe the stock market, maybe a business, maybe real estate in a different way. You're making 8%, you're paying 4%, you're netting 4% on money that isn't even yours. That's arbitrage, and it's how wealthy people multiply their returns without risking their own capital. Here's a real-world scenario. You own a house. It's worth $400,000. You owe $200,000 on the mortgage. That means you have $200,000 in equity just sitting there. Most people leave it there. They think, great, I'm building equity. That's my nest egg. But a wealthy person looks at that and sees trapped capital. That $200,000 isn't working for them. It's just sitting in the house. So they do a cash out refinance. They borrow against that equity at, say, 4.5% interest. They pull out $150,000. Now they take that $150,000 and buy a rental property, or invest it in their business, or put it in an index fund, something that returns more than 4.5%. Let's say they're conservative and it only returns 7%. That's $10,500 a year in returns. Their interest cost is $6,750. They're netting $3,750 a year on money they borrowed. Here's what makes this powerful. That $150,000 is still working for them. It's generating returns, but they also still own the original house, which is likely appreciating. They've essentially doubled their invested capital without using any additional money of their own. Most people would never do this. It feels risky. You're increasing your debt. You're taking money out of your house. But here's the psychology. Wealthy people don't see home equity as safety. They see it as opportunity cost. Every dollar sitting in your house is a dollar that could be working for you somewhere else. And if you can borrow that dollar cheaply and invest it for higher returns, you're winning. The key is the spread. As long as you're earning more than you're paying, the math works in your favor. And the bigger the spread, the better. This is why wealthy people often have mortgages even when they could pay cash. It's not because they can't afford to pay it off. It's because they'd rather keep that cash invested where it's earning more than the mortgage cost. The fourth thing is understanding productive debt versus consumptive debt. This builds on good debt versus bad debt, but it goes deeper into the purpose of the borrowing. Productive debt buys assets or creates capacity to earn more. Consumptive debt buys stuff you consume. Here's the clearest example. Say you're a freelancer. You need a new laptop to do your work. Your old one died. You have two choices. Wait 3 months, save up $1,500, then buy the laptop. Or put it on a credit card at 18% interest and buy it today. Most financial advice would say, wait, don't go into debt, save up and pay cash. But here's what that advice misses. If you wait 3 months, you're not earning income. You can't work without a laptop, so you're losing 3 months of revenue. Let's say you make $4,000 a month. By waiting, you just lost $12,000 to avoid paying maybe $100 in interest. That's insane math. A wealthy person puts it on the credit card immediately. They use the laptop to make $12,000. They pay off the card in full the next month. Maybe they pay $50 in interest. They net $11,950. The debt was productive. It enabled earning capacity. Now contrast that with consumptive debt. You're scrolling Instagram, you see an ad for a new jacket, it's $300, you don't need it, but it looks cool. You put it on a credit card. That jacket doesn't help you earn money, it doesn't appreciate, it just sits in your closet, and you're paying 18% interest on it. That's consumptive debt, and it's financial poison. Here's another example. Student loans. Everyone has an opinion about student loans. Some people say they're good debt because education is an investment. Others say they're a trap. The truth, it depends on what you're studying and what you're going to earn. If you borrow $50,000 to get a nursing degree and you're going to make $70,000 a year, that's productive debt. The degree increased your earning capacity dramatically. But if you borrow $50,000 for a degree in something with no clear career path and you end up making $35,000 a year, that's consumptive debt. You consumed an experience that didn't increase your productivity. The psychology here is about intention. Before wealthy people borrow money, they ask, what is this debt going to produce? If the answer is cash flow, appreciation, or increased earning capacity, they borrow confidently. If the answer is an experience or a thing they want, they think twice. Most people have this backward. They easily justify consumptive debt because they want it, but they agonize over productive debt because it feels risky. Wealthy people do the opposite. They're ruthless about avoiding consumptive debt, but they're aggressive about taking on productive debt because they understand that productive debt is how you build wealth faster than your income alone would allow. The fifth thing wealthy people understand is tax optimization through debt. Okay, this one gets a little technical, but stick with me because this is where things get really interesting. In most countries, including the United States, interest on certain kinds of debt is tax deductible. Mortgage interest, business loan interest, investment property interest. That means every dollar you pay in interest reduces your taxable income by $1, and that saves you money on taxes. Here's how this works. Let's say you're in the 24% tax bracket. You have a rental property, you pay $10,000 in mortgage interest this year. That $10,000 reduces your taxable income by $10,000. At a 24% tax rate, that saves you $2,400 in taxes. So your actual cost of that interest isn't $10,000, it's $7,600. The government essentially subsidized 24% of your interest. Now let's say that property is generating $15,000 a year in rental income after all expenses except the mortgage interest. You made $15,000, you paid $10,000 in interest, but $7,600 of it was real cost because of the tax deduction. Your net is actually $12,400. But here's where it gets wild. That property is also appreciating, and you're building equity as the mortgage gets paid down. And you get to depreciate the property on your taxes, which creates additional deductions. Wealthy people stack all these benefits, the cash flow, the appreciation, the tax deductions, the equity buildup, and they're using borrowed money to access all of it. Meanwhile, someone who paid cash for a property gets the cash flow and appreciation, but they don't get the leverage benefits, and they don't get as much in tax deduction. Here's another angle. Business debt. Let's say you own a business. You need $50,000 for new equipment. You could use cash from the business, or you could take out a loan. If you take the loan, the interest is deductible. Plus, you get to keep the $50,000 in the business for other opportunities, and you can often deduct the equipment itself through depreciation. The debt creates a triple benefit: tax deduction, preserved capital, and productive assets. The psychology here is sophisticated. Most people see interest as a pure cost, something to minimize, but wealthy people see it as a tool that creates tax benefits while enabling growth. They're not trying to eliminate interest. They're trying to maximize the return on assets purchased with debt while minimizing the after-tax cost of that debt. And this is why wealthy people have complex financial structures. It's not to hide money, it's to optimize the relationship between debt, assets, taxes, and returns. Now here's what nobody wants to admit. Everything I just explained is completely legal. It's not some secret loophole. It's not shady. It's literally how the tax code is designed to work. The government wants people to invest in real estate. They want people to start businesses. They want people to take productive risks. So they created incentives, tax deductions, favorable treatment, ways to use debt productively. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people will never use these strategies, not because they can't, but because they're too scared. They've been programmed to think all debt is bad. They hear leverage and think risky. They see wealthy people with millions in debt and think they're over-leveraged. But what they're missing is the other side of the balance sheet. If you have $5 million in debt, but $10 million in assets generating cash flow, you're not over-leveraged, you're optimized. If you have zero debt and zero assets, you're not safe, you're stuck. Here's the thing about risk. Doing nothing feels safe, but it's actually one of the riskiest positions you can be in. Your income is tied to a job you could lose, your savings are eroding to inflation, you're not building any additional streams of cash flow, and you're completely dependent on your own labor. That's not safety, that's vulnerability. Using debt intelligently to acquire assets that generate income, that's actually reducing risk. You're diversifying income streams, you're building wealth faster, you're creating options. But our brains don't see it that way, because debt feels scary and doing nothing feels comfortable. This is evolutionary psychology working against us. Our ancestors survived by avoiding immediate dangers. A tiger in the bushes was a real threat. You needed to avoid it, but modern wealth building requires embracing calculated discomfort. Taking on debt to buy assets feels like inviting the tiger in, even though mathematically it's the smartest move. The people who build serious wealth are the ones who override that instinct. They feel the fear, they just don't let it make their decisions. Let me tell you about David. David is 40 years old. He makes $90,000 a year at his job. He's doing pretty well. He's responsible. He's disciplined. David read all the personal finance books. He follows Dave Ramsey. He's been aggressively paying off debt for the last 8 years. He had $40,000 in student loans, paid them off. He had a car loan, paid it off. He even paid off his mortgage early, sent in extra payments every month for 7 years. Now, David is completely debt-free. He owns his house outright, no car payment, no student loans, nothing. He's got about $80,000 in retirement accounts and $15,000 in an emergency fund. David feels good about this. He did what he was supposed to do. He's responsible. He's debt-free. But here's David's reality. His net worth is about $450,000. His house is worth $350,000. His retirement accounts and savings make up the rest. And he's 40 years old. He's been working for 18 years. He's saved diligently, and he has $450,000 to show for it. That's not bad. But here's what David doesn't realize. By focusing exclusively on eliminating debt, he missed massive opportunities. While he was putting extra money toward his mortgage at 4% interest, the stock market was averaging 10%. While he was avoiding any debt like the plague, real estate prices in his area doubled. He played it safe, and safety cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars in opportunity cost. David will probably retire with a paid-off house and maybe $1 million in his retirement account. He'll be fine, but he'll never be wealthy. Now let me tell you about Christina. Christina is also 40. She also makes $90,000 a year, same starting point as David. But Christina approached debt completely differently. 10 years ago, she bought her first rental property. She put $25,000 down on a $200,000 property. She borrowed the rest. That property generates $1,200 a month in rent. Her mortgage is $900. She cash flows $300 a month. 5 years later, she did it again. Used some equity from the first property and her savings to buy a second rental. Same deal, cash flows another $300 a month. Then she bought a third property, then a fourth. Today, Christina owns 5 rental properties. She has about $800,000 in mortgage debt. That sounds like a lot, right? But those properties are worth $1.4 million, and they generate about $2,000 a month in total cash flow after all expenses. That's $24,000 a year in passive income, almost a third of her salary, from assets she bought using mostly borrowed money. Her total net worth? About $700,000. The equity in the properties plus her retirement accounts. But here's the key difference. David has a net worth of $450,000 and no debt. Christina has a net worth of $700,000 and $800,000 in debt. Who's in a better position? Christina, and it's not even close. Because Christina's properties are appreciating, they're generating cash flow, she's getting tax deductions, and her tenants are paying down her mortgages for her. In 10 years, David might have $600,000, Christina will probably have over $2 million. Same income, same starting point, completely different understanding of debt. Christina wasn't reckless. She didn't borrow money for vacations or cars or stuff. She borrowed money to buy assets that produce income. She used debt as a weapon, and that weapon built her wealth. So here's what most people don't realize. The advice to avoid all debt isn't wrong for everyone. If you lack discipline, if you're going to borrow money to buy junk, then yeah, avoiding debt is probably smart. But if you're intentional, if you understand the difference between productive and consumptive debt, then avoiding debt isn't safe. It's limiting. Here's the reframe. Debt isn't the enemy. Stupidity is the enemy. Borrowing money to buy a depreciating car you can't afford? Stupid. Borrowing money to buy a cash-flowing rental property? Smart. Putting a vacation on a credit card and paying minimum payments? Stupid. Putting business equipment on a credit card and paying it off next month? Smart. The tool is the same. The outcome depends entirely on how you use it. And this is where most financial education fails people. It treats everyone like they're irresponsible children who can't handle nuance. Debt is bad, avoid it. That's the message. And for some people, that's probably the right message because they're going to misuse it. But for people who are willing to learn, who are willing to be strategic, that message is limiting. It keeps them trapped in slow wealth accumulation. Think about it. If you only use your own money, you can only buy what you can afford today. But if you use leverage intelligently, you can control assets worth 10 times what you have. And over time, those assets appreciate. They generate income, they compound, and suddenly you're wealthy, not because you earned more money, but because you understood how to deploy money more effectively. Wealthy people get this. They see debt as leverage, as opportunity, as a tool that multiplies results. Poor people see it as a burden, and that perception difference creates the wealth gap. Let's recap the 5 ways wealthy people weaponize debt. First, they distinguish between good debt that makes money and bad debt that costs money. Second, they use leverage to control larger assets with smaller amounts of capital. Third, they practice interest rate arbitrage by borrowing low and investing high. Fourth, they focus on productive debt that builds capacity instead of consumptive debt that buys stuff. And fifth, they optimize taxes through strategic use of deductible interest. These aren't tricks. They're not unethical. They're just a different way of thinking about money and risk. The person who avoids all debt isn't playing it safe. They're limiting their upside. They're choosing slow growth over accelerated wealth building. And here's the thing, you don't need to be rich to start using debt strategically. You need to start using debt strategically to become rich. The question isn't whether you should use debt. The question is whether you understand it well enough to use it as a tool instead of letting it use you, because debt is a weapon. And weapons are dangerous in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to use them. But in the hands of someone skilled, they're the difference between survival and victory. So which one are you going to be? The person who avoids the weapon because it's scary, or the person who learns to wield it effectively? That choice will determine your financial future.